Right, so when we left off, we had been talking about correlational versus experimental research, right? And what we had established was that in correlational research, you are only looking at establishing relationships between two or more variables, right? These might be positive relationships in which if one variable increases, the other variable also increases, right? Which is a positive relationship, such as, for example, self-esteem and academic achievement. So if academic achievement increases, self-esteem is also increasing, right? So that's a positive relationship. Then you might also have negative relationships in which one variable increases and the other decreases, such as, for example, you might have parental support and something like depressive symptoms in adolescents. So if parental support increases, right, depressive symptoms in adolescents decrease, right? So what is important to remember here is that the negative relationship is, again, still a relationship, right? It's just that the direction of the relationship is different from a positive relationship. One increases, the other decreases, right? But it still shows you a relationship. Or you can have a zero relationship in which if one increases, there is no change in the other, right? So that would be no relationship at all. But when we look at correlational research designs, what we say is that these are only good at establishing relationships. We cannot make any inferences about causation, right? We cannot say one variable is causing another. That is something that we really need to remember. On the other hand, in experimental research, we really can do that. We can make inferences about causation. We can say this variable is causing another. How can we do that? Because we are always controlling one of the variables, right, which we call the independent variable, right? That is what we control. And we control it to study its impact on what we call the dependent variable. Another aspect of experimental research that's very, very important is random assignment, that you have the experimental group and the control group, and you randomly assign individuals to either of these groups, right? So that's another thing that's very, very important. So for example, if I'm looking at, let's go with a simple example. If I'm looking at my question is, how does raising the temperature in a room, right, affect students' test performance? So I'm saying if the temperature is very, very hot, that would affect their performance in some way, right? So then my independent variable is room temperature, right? That is what I will be controlling, right? And the dependent variable would be test performance, right? So the dependent variable is the variable on which you are studying the effect of manipulating the independent variable. So you're manipulating the independent variable, which in this case is the room temperature, and you're looking at its effect on students' test performance, which is your dependent variable, right? Now, because you have, and again, so let's suppose you have two groups here, so I divided students into two groups. If for one, I raised the temperature very, very high. For one, I gave them a very nice, comfortable temperature. So when I compare these two groups, I will be able to make inferences about causation, right? About what caused the differences in their test performance, because I was controlling the variables, right? And let's suppose all of the students here have similar mental capability, they're similar in terms of how, well read they are and how well they've prepared for this test. Let's suppose it's an aptitude test and all of them have very similar aptitudes, right? So then that would give me some sort of inference about the independent variable room temperature causing changes in the dependent variable, which was test performance. So that's the greatest strength of the experimental method, which is that it can make inferences about causation, right? So here you have this table in which you have, again, the description of the correlational method, description of the experimental method. When you look at the correlational method, it's basically the investigator is studying participants without altering their experiences. However, in the experimental research method, you have that the researcher is manipulating an independent variable and examining what this manipulation does to a dependent variable, right? Again, a correlational research will let you study relationships between variables, whereas an experimental research method will let you make inferences about cause and effect. Limitations of a correlational method is that you can only establish a relationship. You cannot say one variable is causing the other, right? You can never say that, right? However, with experimental research, you have this limitation in which whatever people are doing in a lab, right, it might not be generalizable to what they do in the outside world, how they behave in the outside world, right? So that's one of the greatest limitations of the experimental method, right? Now we get into some research methods that are more particular to developmental psychology, right? More particular to developmental psychology, and what we see is that these are what we call, firstly, longitudinal research, right? Because see, when we talk about longitudinal research, what we mean by longitudinal research is that you're studying the same people, right, over an elongated period of time, right? So let's suppose you studied a group of individuals when they were 5 years old, right? Then when they were 10 years old, then when they were 20 years old, then when they were 30 years old, then when they were 40. So it's the same group of individuals and you're studying them at different ages. Now, what's the point of doing this? Again, we have to think about what developmental psychology is about. Developmental psychology is particularly about studying development, right? How people are changing and how they're remaining constant over the lifespan, right? Is that something that everyone remembers? That it's about, what's changing and what's constant. So it's very good to be studying people at different ages in order to understand how they're developing, right? So again, in longitudinal research, you have the same group of individuals, right? And you're studying them, right, at different age groups. Now, obviously, this can be very problematic. Let's suppose you started off with a group at 5 years of age. Till the time they got to 10 years of age, most of them had moved from the city, right? Some of them you'd lost contact with. You cannot track them down again. They're no longer interested to be part of this study, right? So what do you do at that? This is one of the greatest limitations of the longitudinal research method, which is what we call attrition, that people drop out, right? Now, there is an alternate to longitudinal research, right? Which is what we call cross-sectional research. Right, now what exactly is cross-sectional research? Sorry about that, the spelling seemed to be really out of line. Right, so when we talk about cross-sectional research, right, one of the things that we see is that with cross-sectional research, you're not working with the same group of individuals, right? Rather, to measure development, let's suppose you take a group of people who are 20 years of age, right? And you take another group of people, now this is happening in the same time, who are 30 years of age, another group of people who are 40 years of age. And you compare these three groups of individuals, right, in the same time frame. And that will give you some idea of how people who are 20 years differ from people who are 30 years, and how people who are 30 years differ from those who are 40 years of age. So this will tell you something about how people develop, right? Even though you're not using the same group of individuals, and therefore you do not have the problems that you had in longitudinal research, that you can no longer track down participants. Or obviously, when you're looking at longitudinal research, this research will take a lot of time, right? This will, for example, if you're even looking at comparing the last three groups, which was the 20-year-old group, the 30-year-old group, and the 40-year-old group, this will at least take 20 years, right? In cross-sectional research, that's something that's not necessary because you're comparing three different groups of individuals within the same time frame. Now, obviously, both longitudinal research and cross-sectional research have advantages and disadvantages of their own, right? Let's look at what these are. So again, if we go back to this table, we look here at longitudinal research, right? So the investigator is studying the same group of participants repeatedly at different ages, right? Now, This permits study of common patterns and individual differences in development and relationships between early and later events and behaviors. Obviously, if let's suppose I'm studying you at different ages, I'll be able to tell, how you're changing. I'll be able to track those changes according to things that are happening to you, right? Again, when we have a limitation of a longitudinal research, we say age-related changes may be distorted because of participant dropout. This is what we talked about, that, people might leave the research. Practice effects and cohort effects. Now, what are practice effects? Practice effects are basically that, you, let's suppose, आपने 20 years पे भी उनको एक questionnaire दिया, you gave them a questionnaire. At 30 years, you gave them a questionnaire. At 40 years, you gave them a questionnaire. Now, they will be very familiar with that questionnaire, so they will have, already practiced it because they've taken it, three times, yes, by the time that they're 40. So obviously, that will create a problem. And then we talk about something which is cohort effects. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this term. But cohort effects are basically, for example, you guys come from a particular cohort, right? A particular, generation, you might say, right? People born within the same time frame form part of the same cohort, right? So all of you might share certain characteristics or certain ways of thinking because of the time frame in which you were born. Now, let's suppose if children were born during COVID, right? We see that a lot of them have problems socializing because they might not have had a lot of interaction, right? So that is a cohort effect because it depends on when this child was born, right? It depends on the year in which the child was born, right? So the year in which a child was born, right? Or around the same years, let's suppose 2-3 years, give or take. So that is what determines your cohort. And then obviously, let's suppose if I'm studying the same group of individuals at different times, whatever I find out about their development might be because of certain cohort effects, might be because, they all share certain characteristics as a generation or as a cohort. Make sense? When we look at cross-sectional research, right, what we have is that the investigator studies groups of participants differing in age at the same point in time, right? Now, this is obviously more efficient than the longitudinal design because it's, time efficient, right? You do not have problems such as people dropping out, right? Or even practice effects because you're studying one group of individuals only once, right? It does not, however, permit study of individual developmental trends, obviously, because you're studying 3 different groups of people. So you cannot make any inference about how individuals develop, what are the patterns in individual development, right? And age differences may be, again, distorted by cohort effects. Now, when you were studying, in cross-sectional research, people who are 20 years of age, people who are 30 years of age, people who are 40 years of age. Now, let's suppose you observe some differences in all 3 of these groups. Now, it is very possible that those differences only exist because all of these groups of individuals are from different cohorts. It's not because this is telling you something about development, but because this is a different cohort, because these were born in a different time. These individuals were born in a different time, and these were born in a different time. So the differences that you are able to tell between them might just be because they come from different generations, right? Or different cohorts. The cohort is the actual word here. I say generation just to make it simpler for you to understand, all right? So yes, this is a little bit about cross-sectional and longitudinal research. Then, in order to sort of take away the problems we have what we call the sequential research design, right? Now, what is a sequential research design? A sequential research design is that an investigator conducts several similar cross-sectional or longitudinal studies, right? So you're conducting longitudinal and cross-sectional studies, right? What does that do? That permits longitudinal and cross-sectional comparisons, and it reveals cohort effects. Rather than the research being plagued by cohort effects, you understand what cohort effects are. Now, this might have the same problems as longitudinal and cross-sectional strategies, but the design itself helps identify difficulties. Let me show you what a cross-sectional design looks like. What a sequential design looks like. So basically what we said was that in a sequential design, you have, a pairing up of cross-sectional and longitudinal designs, right? Now, what does that mean? That means that, let's suppose in 1945, you started out your research, right? You started researching 20-year-olds, right? Sorry about that. You started in 1965. Sorry about that. So you started your research in 1965, right? And you started looking at 20-year-olds, right? And you wanted to compare them when they were 30-year-olds, when they were 30-year-old, and when they were 40-year-old, right? So you waited 10 years and you compared them to what they were like at 20-year-old, right? And then, so this is a longitudinal sequence because you are comparing the same group of individuals at different points in their life. Do you see that? So, you're going till 1985, right? Because that is when they will be 40 years old, right? So this is a longitudinal sequence because you're studying the same group of individuals at different points in their life, right? Okay. Now, what do you do when you compare this or you add a cross-sectional design to this? Now, let's suppose, you're at year 1985, right? Now, what you do is that you compare, this first cohort that you had. This was your first cohort, right? You compare the 40-year-olds here to 30-year-olds, right? This is another group that you have then. This is your second cohort, right? And you also compare them to 20-year-olds, right? So this is your third cohort, right? Now, what will this do? This is what you call a cross-sectional design, that in the same year, you're studying different groups of individuals at different points in their life. So here you have 20-year-olds, you're comparing them to 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds. So this is a cross-sectional design, right? And you can compare this to this longitudinal design, right? And you can discover what the differences are between these two different, whatever you're finding, what are the differences between them, right? So because you can compare these 20-year-olds to these 20-year-olds as well. And you can find out, what are the cohort effects? The 20-year-old cohort 1 that you were studying in 1965, how does that compare to the 20-year-old cohort that you're studying in 1985? Right? So that will tell you something about the differences between these cohorts as well, right? So basically in the sequential design, what you do is that you combine a cross-sectional design with a longitudinal design, right? And, again, the strength is that it permits longitudinal and cross-sectional comparisons and it reveals cohort effects, but again, it might have the same kind of problems that you had with longitudinal and cross-sectional designs, right? Okay, now very briefly, we will introduce ourselves to some ethical concerns within developmental psychology research, right? So one of the first things that you have is that you obviously are obliged to protect your participants from harm. And this can be any kind of harm. It might be physical or psychological, right? So that's one of the things that you need to consider, that you always need to have your participants' well-being as a priority. Then there is informed consent, right? So you need to make sure that you tell them what this research is about, right? And sometimes in developmental psychology, you're looking at children. So then you need to have the parents' informed consent, right? That's something that you should have if you're working with children, right? And that for example, if you're working with a child or an elderly person, you make sure that if you're explaining your research to them, you use language that is age appropriate, that they would understand, right? So that's something that's very, very important, right? You make sure that they know that they can withdraw at any time at all without any consequences, right? That's another part of informed consent, right? Then obviously you have privacy, that you know, basically shield whatever it is that you know about them. It's confidential, it's completely private. The information that you've collected from them, you know, nobody has access to it. That you use, for example, pseudonyms when you talk about them, or when you know, record their information, so that nobody can get access to it, right? Knowledge of results. So, you know, whatever findings you have this obligation to share it with your participants, because they participated in this research, right? So, you know, that's one thing that you need to do. Then beneficial treatment. So, for example, every participant has the right to a beneficial treatment. Let's suppose you find out that there's a particular therapeutic intervention that really works well with adolescent children. So then every adolescent child that you work with has a right to that beneficial treatment, right? So these are the rights of research participants that you always need to really be careful about when you're doing research. And you need to think about these you know, ethical concerns as you go into the research field.